So, again, we like to highlight topics here that are relevant, that you hear a lot about, but don't know a lot about. I think the Russian Revolution, it is taught, it is known, um, but it's so mired in decades.
I'll be honest, I don't know much about it at all.
No one does,
Yeah.
not in America. It's mired in decades of politics, propaganda from both sides of the situation. It makes it incredibly difficult to truly learn about. What I think is interesting a lot is that I'm going to mention a lot of statistics, a lot of numbers today, and most of them come after the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, because a lot of Western historians didn't have access to reliable documents or numbers during the whole 70 years of the Cold War. So a lot of our information from about these early Soviet history is very recently obtained. Because again, it's so mired in politics. The Soviet Union didn't want to give accurate numbers or accurate history. They wanted to teach their own history of the situation. And of course, America didn't want you to know the true story of the situation either. They wanted to teach you their version of the story of the scary Reds and the scary communists. And so all of it leads to population today that is woefully undereducated on a very, very critically important piece of history um, that uh, it's a shame. It's a shame that no one knows more about it. And then we're only going to touch the surface of it today. This is definitely not all of it. I think it's important to recognize it from how Russian society was in the 1910s and late 1800s. This is something most people don't know, is that Russia was practicing serfdom up until 1861.
Wow.
That serfdom is a purely medieval mode of economy. It is the forced servitude of landed
Labor.
peasantry to work the lands of a local nobleman or aristocrat. So peasants had their own plots of land, but they had plots of land that was owned by the landlord, the noble, the aristocrat that they had to plow as well, and they wouldn't get any share of that crop. Most countries in Europe eliminated that within the Middle Ages. I don't know for certain the exact year, but remember that we talked about the Peasants' Revolt of 1381?
Yeah.
Peasants in England were demanding an end to serfdom in 1381, and they achieved it within the next century
It took half a thousand years.
for Russia
Half
to
a
catch up.
millennium, yeah.
That's how much different Russia is from the rest of the West at this point in the world. I mean, that's only 50 years before the Russian Revolution that we're talking about. And of course, things weren't really great for the peasants after the end of serfdom still, but they at least weren't serfs anymore. In the late 1890s, Russia had a population boom that kind of came at a poor time because Russia was also, again, you can see why they're seen as kind of backwards and impoverished when they're still practicing serfdom into the 1860s. And they also have imperial envy, kind of like Germany did when we talked about that a few weeks ago. Russia desperately is jealous of Britain and France's great colonial empires, and they want a piece of the pie themselves. And so they start a bunch of wars while their population is growing, while their infrastructure is completely lagged behind the rest of the West, and they're completely unindustrialized. And so they have too many people to feed, and they're going on to costly wars, and it creates a huge food shortage. So a country that is already suffering from poverty is just making itself worse. And then, of course, there's a famine to make things even more worse. And this is shocking, but 400,000 Russians starved to death in the famine of 1891 to 1892.
Wow.
Because of these issues in the rural areas, a lot of Russians end up moving towards cities. And this is a story as old as the 1800s. That would come with urbanization, industrialization, comes crowded cities, comes illness, overcrowding, poor living conditions, even worse working conditions, unlivable wages, complete exploitation of labor. And so these urban areas become rife for civil unrest and crime and eventually organization for reform. And also the Tsar at this point is completely out of touch with reality. Tsar Nicholas II, he makes himself completely unpopular with the Russo-Japanese War. Again, this is another one of those costly wars where Russia is trying to reform itself through military might rather than internally and economically. They go to war with Japan thinking, oh, Japan will knock them out of the water. There's a bit of racism involved in the assumption that they would knock Japan out of the water in this war, and they got completely wiped clean. It was an I would say it's similar in terms of humiliation to Vietnam, where America, this big imperial power, marched into Vietnam and got their butt kicked. They were woefully unprepared for it.
Was there
Sa-
a reason that Japan had such strong military power despite being such a small country?
Russia was, no, sorry. Japan was also going through colonial insecurity as well. Japan saw the imperial powers of America and England and France, and just like Russia, they also modeled themselves after that, but they were a bit more successful in it. And their military at that point was
That
far
makes
more
sense.
industrialized. So you can kind of see colonialism as it's like a parasitic
Mind
brainworm
virus.
that seeps into the leaders of nations in the late 1800s and early 1900s. After the war was so unpopular and so humiliating that it led to a bunch of protests. And in 1904, they set up a conference for Russian reform, and most of those reforms were just kind of ignored, which led in 1905 to a bunch of protesters carrying religious items and pictures of the Tsar Nicholas marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and they demanded their reforms. They were thinking they would demand their reforms directly to the Tsar himself, and he would sign them. And it was a very peaceful protest. The Tsar wasn't home that day, but his police chief was, and the police chief ordered all of his soldiers to open fire on the protesters, and they killed hundreds of them,
Wow.
leading to a complete, almost like a mini revolution that summer, where strikes were organized across the whole country, completely shutting down Russia's even worsening economic situation and worsening food situation. And because of these strikes, Russia ends up settling one sort of reform, which is the Duma, which is kind of like a lower parliament for like it's not a constitutional monarchy at all, but it's sort of like Russia, like the House of Commons in England.
Yeah.
But it mostly favors the upper middle classes and industrialists, and the Tsar can also automatically veto whatever he wants the Duma passes with no questions asked. So it doesn't really do much.
So he has absolute power over any government they establish.
And then at this point as well, Tsar Nicholas himself, there's a lot of corruption with a lot of he favors a lot of his old aristocratic families. We're still, again, not too far from a very feudal society, so he's still favoring the aristocrats. There's corruption over whether or not he's being manipulated by his councilmen and stuff and nobles. And of course, Rasputin was one of those people that people were afraid that was really controlling the government behind the scenes, who was, of course, unelected. His wife was German, which caused increased problems in World War I in terms of distrust of the authoritarianism. And we're going to do a brief recap of World War I here, because that's when things really change. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of civil unrest here. And then we talked about World War I a couple weeks ago, how completely snowballed it was from a war with very little purpose.
It was very political with no real intent or meaning behind it.
Yeah, so we left off with World War I. A war started over a complete political crisis that snowballed out of control. People are now marching to war thinking it'll end quickly, and they don't really have a strong idea of why they're fighting. But at that point, when you think it's going to be a quick war, it seems like for Russia, we're going to war to secure the Balkans and to get back against Germany and stuff like that. In 1914, the war is still mobile. It's these big, giant armies marching against each other, and stalemate quickly established itself in the Western Front, which is much physically smaller than the Russian front because it's condensed in all of France. The German advance is stopped outside of Paris, and the two sides dig these trenches in the earth, and they just hold these lines together and futilely fight back and forth, trying to take literally yards of land with no success. In 1915, the war is completely in stalemate, and they start experimenting with new ideas. This is when they come up with the idea for gas warfare, developed in 1915. Planes are now they now put machine guns on planes. They will start working on tanks pretty soon, and a lot of other strange. You look at the contraptions that these sides were making to try and desperately try to break this stalemate. It's utterly insane what they were doing. This is where helmets were developed because they realized if the felt caps they
Really?
were wearing were completely they were
Useless.
useless. They didn't protect anyone at all. And it's funny that in a way World War One was they looked back to the Middle Ages. That's how barbaric the World War One was. They started carrying clubs and shovels for when they raided trenches. They would literally start beating
No,
each other to death.
I'm more interested in the helmet thing. So helmets did not exist before 1950?
Not really, no.
Wow.
If you look
It took them
if you
that
look at the
long.
British helmet, which the Americans also used, it's a very flat with a round top and a wide circle brim. That's a medieval helmet. That was the British Army developed that specifically basing it off the kettle helmet from the Middle Ages. That's how I mean this was
I guess
they had never
armor
this was
existed,
the
but
first time that the people had used metal armor in almost 500 years.
wow.
So when the time came in World War One, they said we need armor again for the first time in hundreds of years. They looked back to the Middle Ages, and that's just how barbaric World War One was. But anyways, the point is that they are looking for new ideas. Uh, Britain and France tend to focus on their colonial powers in this year, and they go to fight off in the Middle East in thinking they can knock Turkey out of the war in Gallipoli. Gallipoli was a year-long battle that ended in utter failure. So the point is, after trying new things in 1915, they come back in 1916, beaten, broken, and they think, okay, we can't win it in other fronts. We can't win it by making new technology. The only way we can win it is if we all push really, really hard all at once. And so Russia, Britain, and France, and Italy start planning together. Let's all throw as many soldiers at the wall as possible and see if that just completely beats Germany out of the war through attrition, just exhausts them. Um, Germany is planning this through the Battle of the Somme, and Russia is planning it through the Lydiak, I think it's pronounced, offensive, and also the Brusilov offensive, it's known as. The problem was that Germany had the same exact idea at the same exact time, and they start their own offensive in Verdun in Lower France, throwing as many German soldiers at the wall as possible, thinking that that would exhaust France out of the war. And then France wasn't expecting that. Oh, actually, France got intelligence on this, actually, and they just ignored it, thinking it wasn't like, well, don't worry about it. And then it happened, and they panicked, and they said, Britain and Russia, please start your offensives now. We're dying in Verdun. And there's a week-long bombardment in the Somme. We're getting to the Russian Revolution, I promise here. This is all related. Point is, Britain starts a battle of the Somme offensive that is the single bloodiest day in British military history. About 19,000 people died in a single day.
Were they soldiers or
Soldiers.
Wow.
On the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Russia starts their offensive in the northern German sector of their front, but it's actually the southern offensive led by a general named Brusilov that ends up being, again, very intense, but also the most successful of all of these offensives. It makes a lot of miles gained, and it basically mortally weakens the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it seems like a great victory. I mean, all of these other battles are going horribly, but it seems like Russia is doing good. It seems like they're close to knocking Austria-Hungary out of the war from a general's perspective. But from a soldier's perspective, it's completely different. Russia lost anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million soldiers in that one offensive. And the fact that there is such a disparity between that's a 500,000 soldiers disparity. We don't know the exact numbers. That should clue you in as to just how messy and violent this fighting was, that we don't have accurate numbers of how many people died. This is a quote from Jeffrey Maciejewski in his paper, The Final Nail, The Russians in 1916. Stories from home of food shortages, rampant inflation, and other hardships led Russian soldiers to revolt. They were willing to defend their motherland but had nothing to gain from further offensive action. Russian Lieutenant General Nicholas Golovin wrote that after that war, Russian troops viewed their losses as unnecessary and no longer believed further sacrifice would benefit the motherland. In their eyes, the war was lost and their leaders were doing nothing more than squandering their lives. The Brusilov offensive, for all its tangible success, was little more than a Pyrrhic victory. The Russian army lost a significant number of its new junior officers, ones who hoped to transform the army. While Russia could replace these men, it could not replace their competence and their desire to modernize both the Russian military operations and thought. Furthermore, these losses forced the Russian army to replace reformers with revolutionaries who would soon infect their fellow soldiers. New officers commanded little respect and could not instill discipline in their revolutionary-minded troops. Many regiments mutinied, even under penalty of death. Some officers refused to order their men into combat, fearing they would be shot. John Morrow Jr. concisely states that upon the heels of their greatest victory, Russian soldiers plunged into the depths of despair. End quote. This had the total inverse effect. Russia was completely exhausted after this year of battling. France was going through the same thing at the time. In fact, a lot of French soldiers also mutinied at the same exact time and refused to fight any longer because this is a year. Again, 1916, these three battles all lasted a single year. The Battle of the Somme started about March, didn't end until January 1917.
And not a single person could name the actual reason that these were occurring.
I mean, at that point, Archduke Franz Ferdinand's name was long lost to these people's mouths, just like it was to mine in a second ago. So all of these situations are piling up. In February of 1917, a large bread riot of people gathered together outside of the Winter Palace and they just demanded for food because they were starving. And at first, the Petrograd garrison was there to repel them, but they ended up abdicating and joined them. And they ended up, and the Tsar had no choice but to abdicate, and he gave up his power. And the Duma ministers would set up their own provisional government that was kind of liberal. It was still antiquated, but it was more liberal democratic. They promised an election that they never delivered on. Technically, none of these ministers were elected. They just filled a void. And they decided that we'll have an election, guys, but let's wait till after the war. They were still continuing the war against Germany because they were afraid of violating their treaty with France and England. On a brief side note, just to show you the kind of progress that these revolutions made, women were given equal rights to vote by the ex-Duma, it's called the provisional government. They gave women equal rights to vote and passed a lot of reformative measures, but it wasn't enough. They were still continuing the war against Germany that was increasingly unpopular and making food ever more scarce. As this time went on, Germany actually exiled Vladimir Lenin, who was exiled for causing a lot of social unrest. They actually trained him back into Russia and funded his he became leader of the Bolsheviks, which were a radical communist or socialist movement. The German Empire not only snuck him into Russia, but they paid him and gave him funds, hoping that he would topple the Russian government and that would knock Russia out of the war. They were right. That's exactly what happened. But I think Germany would end up live to regret that decision. Eventually, as the provisional government grows increasingly unpopular, the Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks become increasingly popular with their criticisms levied up against the provisional government. And eventually, the Petrograd garrison you mentioned earlier is moved out of St. Petersburg, and Lenin moves in with his Red Guard militia. This is a quote from Mark Cartwright at worldhistory.org. The Bolsheviks arrested key members of the provisional government, occupied telegraph offices and railway stations, took over the central bank, and, if only symbolically, attacked the Winter Palace. The provisional government attempted to call troops from the northern front, but it was not successful. In the end, it was an almost bloodless coup. The Bolsheviks had effectively launched an entirely opportunistic revolution. With very little bloodshed, Vladimir Lenin and the first communist system of government was established in St. Petersburg in 1917. And just as a quick side note, it's called the October Revolution, but it actually took place in November of 1917 because Russia was using the Julian calendar, where this early November period was actually in October. So just to make things more confusing for you.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So at that point, Russia had undergone a complete socialist revolution, but with surprisingly little warfare involved. It wasn't until after Russia officially removed itself from World War I that it erupted into bloodshed. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty, established in early 1918, officially removed Russia from the war and lost 1 million square miles of territory to Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. This was huge and incredibly unpopular. And it wasn't popular with Lenin either, but Lenin kind of had no choice. The Russian army could not afford to keep fighting the war against Germany, and they were eventually forced into signing this treaty. But it was unpopular nonetheless. And a lot of anti-Bolshevik sentiment organized itself loosely into what's known as the White Army, which went to war against Lenin's Red Army. Um, the White Army, this is a quote from lumenlearning.com, was a loose confederation of anti-Bolshevik forces aligned against the communist government, including landowners, Republicans, conservatives, and conservatives by 1918 standards. So we're talking monarchists, uh, middle-class citizens, reactionaries, pro-monarchists, liberals, army generals, and even non-Bolshevik socialists who still had grievances, and democratic reformists voluntarily united only in their opposition to Bolshevik rule. Their military forces were bolstered by forced conscriptions and terror. So that should give you an idea that the White Army is completely unorganized. It's not unified at all. There are people with vastly different political ideologies, and they're all loosely fighting for the same idea. That is not a good recipe for victory in war. The Bolsheviks controlled all the major cities, most of the supply lines, and the White Army had support in the rural areas, and that was about it. It was still an incredibly costly war where 7 to 12 million casualties were
Oh
had
my
in
God.
about 3 years, less than 3 years. It was horrific. And this is immediately off the tails of World War I. So at the end of this, I mean, Russia's economy is completely devastated.
I mean, I've heard of how Germany suffered after World War One, but I had no idea Russia was this bad.
Russia probably suffered way worse.
Yeah.
Entirely worse. In World War I alone, Russia and Germany actually suffered about equal casualties, depending on some numbers. But post-war, if you count the Russian Revolution, which I think you should, Russia was left in an absolutely atrocious state that Germany was at least way better off from. And if you want to make things even worse, there's the Red Army, there's the White Army, but did you know there was also a Green Army? This is from militaryhistory.org. The Green Army was comprised mostly of landed peasants. The Greens were a loose-knit coalition that came together to resist Soviets. So they're kind of like a third party, which sounds kind of reasonable, but the group was particularly enraged by the communist policies of confiscating crop harvests and livestock to feed the urban poor in the Red Army. So farmers tend to have strange political opinions that they were not okay with feeding the poor and the urbans, and that's why they picked up arms to go to war against both the Reds and the Whites. And also, there was even a blue army. So it's just looking like all the colors of the rainbow are involved here. And we're not going to get into the blue army, but it was there. Trust me. And the White Army was supported by the Allied powers in World War I, but they quickly got confused by it. As you can see, there's so many different sides of it, and if the White Army was hardly organized, then how were France, America, England, and dozens of other countries who also lended support to the White Army, how are they going to be organized? And while fighting World War I at the same exact time. So, and this is shocking. This comes from Smithsonian Magazine. People don't realize this. When I say that the Allied powers supported them, I don't just mean troops. I don't just mean money or guns or tanks, which they did give, but they actually lended physical on the ground troops. 13,000 American
That's
soldiers.
surprising. That's really surprising.
13,000 American soldiers fought in the Russian Civil War in 1918 and 1920.
Is this not during a time of like isolationist policy for the United States?
America was isolationist until World War I. That kind of died.
But they were still they promoted that, right, during World War II. And that's why it took them so long to get involved.
Isolationism was always kind of like a back and forth thing. At this point, the pendulum had kind of swung the other way with Woodrow Wilson. Supporting the Red Army was seen as militarily opportunistic because they were afraid that Lenin's army or Lenin's government would actually align themselves with Russia and then overturn their advances in World War I. And also there was, of course, communist scare. I mean, it's such a complete mess of a situation. Um, Judging the Soviet Union and Lenin's ideals is a whole mess on its own. But you look in this mess, and it's hard to really make heads or tails of it politically. I mean, you have the White Army, the Green Army, the Red Army, and the Red Army ultimately triumphed over the White Army, but with heavy casualties, and started 70 years of Soviet rule. Which, by the way, the word Soviet, I forgot to mention this now that I'm thinking about it. Soviet was a term for like a coalition or a council.
Is it a Russian word?
Yes, it was. It's because a lot of Soviets were established in these urban environments to organize strikes, kind of like a union. So the Soviet Union is kind of like a workers council, sort of. But yeah, that's a very very loose overview of what pushed Russia to revolution and what pushed them into civil war and why the Soviet Union triumphed over all these other movements going on at the same time.
Did it have like an official end, or was it just
About 1921.
1921?
That's
That
when
gave him about 10 years.
I mean Lenin established a power and a Soviet government in about a week in the October Revolution, which was actually in November, and that was again very bloodless. But after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty set off the Russian Civil War, that took about 2 years to really end, but it didn't officially end until early 1921. And again, most of that information comes from lumenlearning.com, history.com, militaryhistory.org, and that wonderful paper. What was it called? Excuse me. The Final Nail, the Russians in 1916.
That's a lot. That's a lot of Russian politics that come into play.
I highly recommend anyone to look into it more because you hear a lot about Russians, you hear a lot about
I know nothing. Personally,
communism,
I know nothing
socialism.
about Russian politics.
I think we
so-
should do an episode on communism and socialism in general, but
Yeah.
that's another topic.
It's also I love stories like that because it obviously it was very bloody, which is very that's not what I like about it. What I like about it is that hindsight is 2020, and I'm sure at the time this seemed incredibly complex and convoluted, but it's just like a mess. It's like a snowball, like just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling, and nobody really knows what started it. But now they have to deal with it. They have to deal with all the consequences of it, and that's how a lot of things in history happen.
I think it's tragic that at the root of the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War was the exploitation of labor. A lot of workers were disgruntled. The government was mismanaged. They were starving. They were exploited by the companies they worked for. Their factories were filthy. Their homes were crowded and filthy, and the government was not taking care of them. And all they asked was that the government took care of them. And you could argue this revolution left them off worse than they were before. But at the end of the day, all they had to do was just take care of their workers and take care of the people that actually comprise of their country. But they were more concerned with the aristocrats, taking care of the aristocrats, with winning a war against Germany that was ultimately not necessary. And even the White Army could not unify themselves under one simple cause, and instead they were bloated with people that still wanted a monarchy, that still wanted to put the Tsar back in power. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, if happy countries don't revolt. If the Russian people were fed, if they were taken care of, and if their workers weren't exploited, there would have been no Russian Civil War or revolution.
And that's why we're called history repeating, because we see scenarios like this all throughout history. And you went back to the 1300s for the peasant revolution. This is 500 years later, and they're still fighting the same fight.
Yep, I mean, the story of labor rights is very cyclical, and it's still ongoing.
Yes.
And also the propaganda to
That is another important
get
thing.
people. I mean, the White Army, sure, it was bolstered by aristocrats and ex-monarchists, but it was fought by rural peasants that were convinced that they needed to reinstall the monarchy or install a different form of government. So it's a mess.
When we come back, we'll be talking about eugenics, just a general overview as
Very
well as
very light topic to move on to.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the lightest either. But
No, I'm saying this is a dark topic this is both a dark episode.
And we'll discuss that a bit more when we're back in a sec. You're listening to History Repeating on Hillsborough College's Hawk Radio, live from Ybor City, and we are back, and we'll be discussing eugenics. So before I start talking about that, I want to give listeners a warning that the content I will be discussing may be considered disturbing or unsettling. Discussion will include eugenics, forced sterilization, and human experimentation. If this could potentially be upsetting, now is the time to tune out. We won't hold it against you. We will be back next Wednesday, and we'll be talking about something else, hopefully not as dark. But
Probably
I'm
not.
sure, yeah, probably not. I'm sure you've heard the term eugenics. It's not something that often comes up in history other than the Holocaust or Native American genocide. That's usually what it's referring to. According to PBS, this is the definition provided, eugenics was a commonly accepted means of protecting society from the offspring and therefore equally suspect of those individuals deemed inferior or dangerous: the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, criminals, and people of color. So it is a very, very, very backwards idea, and we have definitely moved away from that, though I still think eugenics is prevalent.
It's still, there's still like little traces of it.
Yeah.
It's basically the idea that someone inherently has a gene in them that makes them violent or less intelligent.
And this was core to Adolf Hitler's beliefs, which is why it usually
we
comes
mentioned
up.
it a little bit last week.
Yeah, it comes up in a lot of discussion relating to the Holocaust. You might have heard it in discussion of Native American genocide, things that I will not repeat, but it is very...
I think one thing I didn't really highlight last week's episode is that Hitler's hatred towards Jewish people, I think a lot of people assumed that it was religious, and it was. They thought that they were killing them because they believed in a different religion than the Germans, but that's not entirely true. I feel like Hitler's reasoning for executing 6 million Jewish people was that he believed that they were genetically inferior to them because of eugenics, decades of eugenics, quote-unquote, research that he used as his basis for his crimes.
Eugenics also sometimes refers to the more early scientific belief that different races were technically different species, or that some races were lesser evolved than others, which is all beyond incorrect, for sure.
There's even a sort of problematic argument, or not problem. There's an argument out there that even referring to humans as different races is problematic because it gives you the idea that someone who is African or Asian or has different skin color is a different race of human being. And while there is definitely cultural differences, there is genetically no difference between a black, white, Asian, any ethnicity. They are all humans. There's genetically no difference.
And this is why eugenics still has a ways to go from being completely eradicated from the mind. You know, there are still... Medical eugenics is extremely recent, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the sterilization programs that took place in the United States throughout the 20th century. So this is just about the same time as the Russian Revolution is where we start. In the early 20th century, this is a quote from Alex Stern, who's a researcher and author of the book Eugenic Nation, Faults and Frontiers of Better Breeding in America. In the early 20th century, across the country, medical superintendents, legislators, and social reformers affiliated with an emerging eugenics movement joined forces to put sterilization laws on the books. Such legislation was motivated by crude theories of human heredity that posited the wholesale inheritance of traits associated with a panoply of feared conditions such as criminality, feeble-mindedness, and sexual deviance. Many sterilization advocates viewed reproductive surgery as a necessary public health intervention that would protect society from deleterious genes and the social and economic costs of managing, quote, degenerate stock.
It's like the nature versus nurture argument, except the nature advocates took over, and then they did what they thought was natural next. That they forced people to no longer give birth
And
by mutilating them.
Yeah. As much as people don't want to admit it, this is a hot topic today in discussions of, I know the Sydney Sweeney jeans ad was a big deal. I think that was like 6 months ago now. But that in itself is related to eugenics, talking about what genes are pure, what color are your genes. That is eugenics discussion.
Which ultimately leads to ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
That's why people commit genocide, is because they believe that it's not just because they hate them, it's because they have reasons why they hate them in their mind.
It's a pseudoscience.
They believe that by getting rid of them forcibly that they will purify their gene pool and thus make their country better, and it is completely unbacked by any sort of research or science that holds any merit whatsoever.
And usually people sort of attribute these kind of mindsets in the United States to the South. But ironically, the state with the most eugenics programs was California. A quote from PBS: while California's eugenics programs were driven in part by anti-Asian and anti-Mexican prejudice, southern states, sorry, this goes into southern states. What I meant to say was California had a lot of programs. The state of California paid doctors, this is incredibly recent, between 2006 and 2010 to perform tubal ligations on nearly 150 inmates, many of which were coerced into the operation. Here is a quote from Andrea Estrada at UC Santa Barbara. Beginning in 1909 and continuing for 70 years, California led the country in the number of sterilization procedures performed on men and women, often without their full knowledge and consent. Approximately 20,000 sterilizations took place in state institutions, comprising 1/3 of the total number performed in the 32 states where such action was legal. These were also federally funded programs, many of which were promoted by a movement of pro-eugenics movement in the early 1900s, and it wasn't until much later, the 70s or 80s, when these programs started to phase out. And while California's eugenics programs were one of the highest in the nation, there were a lot of other concerning programs, such as in Mississippi, where the Mississippi appendectomies took place. And if you know what an appendectomy is, it is not sterilization. People were misled and coerced into it, thinking that it was the removal of the appendix. Quote from PBS: Mississippi appendectomies was another name for unnecessary hysterectomies, which is the surgical removal of the uterus, performed at teaching hospitals in the South on women of color as practice for medical students. And a lot of time women were not informed, did not give consent, and were often treated very little for pain. That was another part of eugenics, was there was this belief that black men and women did not experience pain the same way that white people did.
And where do you think they got that from?
Yeah, which of course
Whipping,
is not rooted in
torture,
in any realistic basis whatsoever. Other examples of sterilization in the United States include the sterilization of Native American women, which is probably one of the more famous ones, given our bloody history regarding Native Americans. And this continued as recent as the 1980s. Women were secretly given tubal ligations while under anesthesia for appendectomies, again, misleading women into thinking they are getting appendectomies, and really, doctors go in and perform sterilization. According to author Dr. Gregory W. Rutecki, it's estimated that as many as 25 to 50% of Native American women were sterilized between 1970 and 1976, just 6 years. Almost half the population of Native American women. And the topic that inspired today's episode that I was recently reading about is sterilization in Puerto Rico. Women were coerced into taking birth control without knowing the full extent of the pill, what it did, and what the side effects were. In fact, the being used as guinea pigs to test the side effects. From the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, starting in the 1950s, Puerto Rican women were coerced into sterilization and used as test subjects in developing the modern birth control pill. They were targeted primarily due to issues of eugenics and were not given much, if any, information about either the operation or the pill, and written off as unreliable when describing side effects. That is about what I have.
If I may draw a line here, we talked about. I'm gonna bring this back to imperialism somehow. Believe me. May I?
Yeah, I mean,
if I may draw, there's
understand.
a straight line here. If we're talking about where these ideas came from, it goes back 1,000 years. I mean, this idea that people are inherently inferior goes back to slavery in the Middle Ages. At first, slavery was done towards conquered nations and tribes. Prisoners of war were conquered and so made slaves. In the Middle Ages, that kind of ran out of style with Christians enslaving Christians, so they said, well, you can enslave people that are non-Christian because they're not Christian. You can do whatever you want to them. Then that kind of lost favor as well. And then in the 1500s, when they conquered South America, Aztec empires, they again started enslaving people on the basis that they are not Christian. But that, again, wasn't really popular anymore after the Protestant Reformation Wars, where the idea of religion's tolerance, like a very rudimentary idea of religious tolerance started to form, and they said, no, we can't really do that. How about we convert them instead of enslaving them? And so again, there's this desire to make people do what you want and subjugate them, and they constantly need an explanation for why. And so they switch to a new idea. It's not because they're not the same religion as us. It's because they are inherently inferior to us. Look at them. They're different. They live differently. Their societies are different, and they're backwards, and they're uncivilized. So then the idea that they were uncivilized was justification to enslave them. And then that's the reason why Africans were ultimately chosen once all the Native Americans started dying of diseases. That's why they said, well, let's enslave Africans, because, again, that idea that they're uncivilized, so it's justified, we can do that, it's their natural place. Then the question of, okay, then why don't we civilize them? Why are we then they're coming under more scrutiny, and they have to, again, change their tune. In the early 1800s, after the American Revolution, the idea of all men are created equal. If all men are created equal, why do we still have slaves? So again, slavers are coming under scrutiny, and they have to come up with new ideas. This is a lineage of 500 years now at this point of coming up with new ideas to justify slavery.
I want to be 100% clear. This has absolutely nothing to do with anthropological science.
None.
That was an excuse.
Exactly, which is what I'm getting to, because in the 1800s, there's a rising anti-slavery movement growing in America, and now slavers are saying they're looking towards the new scientific revolutions that are going on at the exact same time, and they're seeing things like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and new blossoming sciences, and they're saying, okay, we can use that as our new excuse, and they start co-opting science, and they start making their own science, which we now know as eugenics, saying, we're going to justify enslaving Africans, not because it makes us rich, not because we're too lazy to do the work ourselves, but because scientifically they are different, and this is where they belong.
They even argued it was good for them, which is another argument that I've seen come back.
And that it's good
in modern day.
Good for the gene pool of America or France or anywhere.
Eugenics is a very, very dangerous mindset, and I highly encourage our listeners to do more research into it.
But that's why drawing that line back there, I think, is so important, because when you realize that these are just excuses to justify slavery, you realize the basis of eugenics isn't actually science, it's greed. It goes back to slavery. It goes back to an economic model that is violent and outdated and immoral. And eugenics was a phony science that was created around that shell of slavery, that core of slavery. It's a shell that no longer has a core. Slavery does not exist anymore in that form. There is still slavery in the world, but chattel slavery in America does not exist anymore. Yet eugenics still kind of persists, and now it justifies itself as a science, when really, in reality, it was created as purely a means to justify slavery and segregation and racist ideas.
My show was supported by PBS Independent Lens. They have some amazing articles on eugenics, as well as eugenics in the United States and abroad. If you're interested in learning more, Independent Lens did a documentary about it called No Mas Babies, which follows the story of Mexican-American women who were sterilized under duress while giving birth at Los Angeles County USC Medical Center in the 1960s and 1970s. They talk about landmark court cases that affected this, and it is a very good source of information, so I would highly recommend it. Or if you're just interested in the article that I sourced, visit pbs.org/independent lens. You can find the article Unwanted Sterilization and Eugenics Programs in the United States. This article is 10 years old, and some of the information may be outdated, but it is highly worth a read. I highly suggest it. And I definitely suggest, if this topic interests you, looking into it further, because there is a lot that we did not have time to touch on today. It is a very, very
recent,
extensive
shocking history.
Yeah, it's extensive. It's very extensive.
And you can still hear eugenic ideas propagated today on the news by politicians, by people, by celebrities. It's out there. You got to look for it, but once you know what it is, you know how to look for it.
And we want to thank you for tuning in to History Repeating. We will be back again next week at 1 p.m. If you missed any of our previous shows, you can catch us on YouTube at Hawk TV. Thank you so much and have a great day.